A single surge of mechanical humming cut through the quiet drizzle that evening, sending a jolt of relief through me. And, as I'd soon learn, a jolt of fury through the most problematic neighbor in the homeowners association. It was the dead of storm season, and my entire block was cloaked in darkness. Fallen branches and windswept leaves littered the streets. I'd flipped the switch on my brand-new backup generator so I could power the medical equipment I rely on nightly. My chest still felt tight from the day's anxiety, but hearing that motor purr meant safety. I could run my respirator without interruption. Then the pounding on my front door began. 3 sharp raps, followed by an impatient holler. I peered through the window, heart sinking. In the faint glow of my porch light stood the self-appointed queen of our HOA, her. Most neighbors just called her by a nickname that combined her unyielding personality with her role on the board, HOA Karen, though not to her face. I cracked open the door a few inches, preparing for the worst. She wore an impeccable beige raincoat despite the downpour, and her short, frosted blonde hair remained inexplicably perfect under the relentless drizzle. Her eyes narrowed as soon as she spotted me. "Do you realize how loud that thing is?" she barked, jabbing a manicured finger toward my driveway. "Where the generator Saturday, I can hear it from my bedroom." I swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure. "The power went out 2 hours ago, and I need it for my medical device," I explained. "It's not a convenience thing, it's vital to my health. I even keep it behind a sound-dampening fence, so I'm surprised." She cut me off. "Nonsense. I've read the HOA bylaws. There's a limit to how much noise you can generate after 9 p.m., and this atrocious hum is definitely past the decibel limit." I clenched the edge of the door, pulses of frustration coursing through my fingertips. "I have the city's noise ordinance documented. My generator's within the legal threshold. It's new, it's code compliant. I'm sure I can show you the paperwork." Her gaze hardened, lips forming a tight line. "I don't need your so-called paperwork to know what a nuisance it is. And you can't be that reliant on a generator. People lived without them for ages." The anger flared in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "I can't speak for ages ago, but my medical needs are real. I have a prescription to run a CPAP and a specialized respirator for extended outages." She waved a dismissive hand. "I'll be filing an official complaint with the HOA. You'll need to shut it off or face consequences." Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the silhouette of broken power lines and battered trees. The sense of violation I felt at that moment was almost as strong as the fear of losing power for my essential equipment. "Do you want me to risk my health?" I asked softly, unable to hide my disbelief. Karen gave me a smug half-smile. "Don't blame me for your choices. We have rules for a reason. Expect to hear from the board." With that, she spun on her heel and stomped off, leaving me stunned in the doorway. My generator kept humming, quietly, in my opinion, and as I stared at the swirling rain, I felt dread coil around my stomach. Was she really going to try to shut down the device that literally let me breathe? If you think a single complaint is where this nightmare ended, think again. Listen closely, because this story escalates in ways I never imagined, culminating in a standoff that threatened my well-being, my reputation, and even my membership in the very neighborhood I called home. Keep reading, because you won't believe how far HOA Karen was willing to go. My name is Gavin Reed. I'm 35, a technical writer by trade, and I've lived in the Cedar Heights community for about 2 years now. On paper, Cedar Heights was the perfect place for a calmer life. A quiet cul-de-sac, well-kept lawns, friendly neighbors who wave as they walk their dogs. I chose this neighborhood partly because it was close to the hospital I frequent, and partly because the houses were modern enough to handle upgrades like ramps or power connections without fuss. I've had respiratory issues since my early 20s. An inherited condition means I need a respirator on standby whenever I sleep, especially during spring storm season, when pollen spikes my allergies and thunderstorms often knock out the power lines. Without electricity, I risk repeated apnea spells that can lead to dangerous drops in my oxygen levels. So, after the second big power outage last year, I invested in a small but reliable emergency generator. My doctor recommended it to ensure I'd never be stuck gasping in a dark bedroom. My immediate neighbors, Jean and Martin on one side, and a retired couple named the Costas on the other, knew about my generator from day one. They'd even recommended a local contractor who specialized in ensuring quiet operation. He poured a small concrete pad behind my shrubs, added acoustic paneling, and installed a high-grade generator with a muffler system. In short, I did everything right. Or so I thought. A month before the storms hit, I got a letter from the HOA referencing outdoor equipment and requesting the official decibel rating. I promptly sent them the specs. Then, silence. No further questions, no issues, until the night Karen pounded on my door. The next morning, I woke groggy but alive, thanks to the generator. No city power was restored until midday, so the unit ran for nearly 8 hours. I dreaded my mailbox, half expecting a nasty note. Sure enough, I found a folded piece of paper stuffed inside. The HOA board will convene an emergency meeting regarding your generator. All further usage must be halted until the matter is resolved. I felt my stomach drop. Halted? Did they not understand that a generator wasn't some frivolous gadget? Shaking off the dread, I hopped online to look up the HOA bylaws. The text was dense, full of constraints about roof colors, mailbox designs, and yard decorations. But what about essential medical devices? Nothing was spelled out. My heart pounded with a mix of anger and fear. If I complied and turned off my generator in the next outage, I'd be risking my health. Yet if I ignored them, Karen might escalate the fight. She was notoriously tenacious. Some said she once threatened to sue a neighbor for planting unapproved yellow tulips. Trying to breathe through my mounting anxiety, I fired off an email to the HOA contact address, explaining, again, why I needed the generator. I attached documentation from my doctor and the generator's compliance certificate from the manufacturer. Then I waited and waited. My inbox stayed empty. Meanwhile, a swirl of rumor and gossip began to spread around Cedar Heights. Some neighbors whispered that I was pushing the rules, while others rallied in my defense, pointing out that we had bigger problems, like the repeated storm damage. Little did I know, Karen was about to turn this into a full-scale community brawl, complete with noise tests, board hearings, and a cameo by the county's power company. The lines were drawn, and the stakes were higher than I ever imagined. 3 days passed without a peep from the HOA. Rain hammered the rooftops intermittently, as if the weather itself was building toward another fierce storm. My nerves were frayed. Every time the lights flickered, my heart clenched. Would I be forced to endure a black night, breathless, while Karen gloated about her victory over noise pollution? On the 4th day, my phone buzzed with a text from Martin next door. Heads up. Karen's outside messing with your generator. My pulse spiked. I practically sprinted to the window. Sure enough, there she was, perched in front of the generator's enclosure with a notepad, presumably scribbling something. Dread coiled in my gut. Was she measuring it? Filming it? I threw on a coat and stepped outside, letting the drizzling rain soak through my hair. Karen, can I help you with something? I asked, forcing a polite tone. She barely glanced up. I'm conducting a decibel test. The HOA president asked me to gather evidence. This contraption is clearly too loud. She pointed to a cheap-looking handheld device that measured noise levels. I suppressed a sigh. Karen, that generator isn't even running right now. The power's on. Indeed, the small LED indicator showed it was in standby mode. Her lips pursed. I can still hear a hum. She lifted the meter and let it beep. 60 decibels. Marking it down. I laughed out of pure disbelief. 60 decibels is roughly normal conversation volume, and the city code allows up to 70 after 7 a.m. It's not even close to a violation. She bristled. It's too loud for this neighborhood. Our rules are stricter. And if you think the city code trumps HOA guidelines, you're mistaken. We care about property values and noise levels. Don't try to intimidate me with your medical excuses. Excuse me. I snapped, anger flushing my cheeks. It's not an excuse. It's a legitimate need. She shrugged, scribbling on her notepad. We'll see what the board decides. With that, she pivoted and strutted off. Back inside, I had to quell the urge to throw something. My anger felt almost volcanic. Here was a woman so entrenched in controlling every inch of our neighborhood that she'd questioned my medical condition. I dialed the HOA's official line, determined to speak with someone more reasonable. Instead, I got a polite voicemail telling me, "Please leave a message, and the board will return your call." I left a calm, clear message, explaining the situation. I rely on that generator to power vital medical equipment. I have documentation verifying it meets local noise and safety codes. Please contact me to resolve this amicably. Then I hung up and stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring back immediately. It didn't. That night, the wind howled, and I found myself anxiously checking the weather radar for the next thunderstorm. Any potential blackout threatened more than just mild inconvenience. In the pit of my stomach, I felt a growing sense of dread. Karen is only just getting started. A week of uneasy calm followed. Although the storms raged on and flickered the lights a few times, we miraculously never lost power. My generator never had to kick on. During that lull, I half hoped that maybe the HOA would drop the matter. After all, it was storm season. Surely they had bigger problems than harassing me about a hypothetical noise violation. No such luck. On a gray Monday afternoon, I found an envelope tucked under my doormat. It bore the HOA letterhead in crisp black font. My stomach churned as I ripped it open. Inside was a formal notice. Dear Mr. Reed, this letter serves as official summons to the Cedar Heights Homeowners Association hearing on April 12th regarding your unauthorized generator and alleged noise violations. You are required to attend at 7 p.m. in the community hall. Failure to appear may result in fines, suspension of HOA privileges, and other legal remedies. Sincerely, the Cedar Heights HOA Board. The words "other legal remedies" sent a chill down my spine. Did they truly believe they had the authority to ban me from using life-sustaining equipment? I fired off a text to Martin, who responded with a string of curses at Karen's audacity. Another neighbor, Jean, promised to attend the hearing in my defense. The Costas offered moral support, though they dreaded crossing Karen. She had a knack for petty retribution, like citing people for leaving their holiday wreaths up too long. The day of the hearing loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. I spent hours gathering every piece of evidence that my generator was both necessary and code compliant. The model's official decibel rating, the city's noise ordinance, the manufacturer's pamphlet, a note from my doctor, and even a letter from the contractor verifying the installation. If I was going to step into that lion's den, I'd make sure I was armed with facts. Meanwhile, word spread across the neighborhood that Gavin's generator was causing a stir. Some folks shot me sympathetic glances when I walked to the mailbox, while others gave me the cold shoulder. Karen's small but vocal clique whispered that I was taking advantage of a medical sob story to flout the rules. The tension was palpable. On the morning of April 12th, the sky was bleak, wind rattling the loose shutters on my house. My chest felt tight, not just from my usual respiratory issues, but from raw nerves. At precisely 6:30 p.m., I headed to the community hall, a folder of documents clutched under my arm. I dreaded the confrontation, but I wasn't about to let my rights get trampled by a petty tyrant who refused to recognize a legitimate need. Little did I know that hearing would be only one step in a crescendo of conflict leading to an unexpected intervention from the very people who know best about power, compliance, and safety. The community hall was a modest building near the entrance of Cedar Heights, typically used for holiday parties or yoga classes. Tonight, though, it looked more like a courthouse. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table draped in a dark green cloth. Seated behind it were 5 members of the HOA board, including Karen, who sat squarely in the middle with her arms crossed. Off to the side, a few more neighbors had trickled in, likely out of curiosity or to show support. I took a seat in the front row, flanked by Martin and Jean. They offered encouraging nods, which I appreciated more than words could say. My folder weighed heavily in my lap. A tall, balding man named Robert, the HOA president, rapped a gavel on the table. We call this special hearing to order. The matter at hand is the generator located at 142 Oakwood Drive, belonging to Mr. Gavin Reed. He glanced around. Mr. Reed, are you present? I stood, nerves dancing in my stomach. Yes, I'm here. Robert motioned for me to approach the table. Please state your case. We have a complaint citing noise violations and lack of HOA approval for an outdoor generator. The floor is yours. I exhaled, stepping forward. Thank you. I want to clarify that this generator was installed for medical reasons. I began, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear. I have a respiratory condition requiring consistent electric power for my equipment. The generator is code compliant, meets city noise standards, and was professionally installed. I have documentation if you'd like to see. Karen leaned toward her microphone, looking bored. And did you seek the HOA's explicit permission before installing it? We have a standard architectural review process for any permanent exterior additions. I held up a letter. I emailed the board about it last year. I submitted the generator's specs, even photos. No one responded with any objections, so I assumed it was fine. She clicked her tongue. We get dozens of emails. Your so-called submission might have been lost or incomplete. Regardless, we have strict guidelines. I bristled. I also have a doctor's note verifying the necessity. The Americans with Disabilities Act has provisions about reasonable accommodations. You do realize that refusing to allow a medical necessity could be seen as discriminatory. She raised an eyebrow. We're not refusing reasonable accommodations. We're objecting to the noise it creates. Our neighbors deserve peace, especially at night. Many have complained about that monstrous hum. Is that true? I asked, glancing at Robert. Or is it just Karen complaining? He cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. We've received a handful of complaints, though Ms. Wilson's was the most persistent. I tried to keep my temper in check. The city code allows up to 70 decibels. This generator is listed at 60. If there's a storm and the power goes out, it's essential. I'm not running it for fun. It's purely backup. Karen flipped through her stack of papers. We have a decibel reading showing it can spike to 63.6. That's borderline unacceptable in Cedar Heights. Borderline is still under 70, I snapped. Plus, it's an emergency generator. The storms have knocked out power repeatedly. Where do you expect me to go if my home can't provide the electricity I need? Robert held up a hand. We understand, but the board has to balance the needs of all residents. Perhaps there are quieter models, or maybe you can relocate it inside the garage. I almost laughed. Relocating a generator indoors is a carbon monoxide hazard, and this is already a quiet model with acoustic enclosures. There's no feasible way to reduce the noise further without making it non-functional. Karen pounced. So you admit it's a nuisance. You can't reduce it further, so it remains in violation. A wave of anger coursed through me. It's less of a nuisance than losing power for hours. This is my health. Don't you care about that? She shrugged. We care about the community's quiet enjoyment. That's our job. A heated mutter rippled through the small audience. Jean stood, voice trembling with anger. Karen, you're ignoring the bigger picture here. He needs this. If you force him to remove it, you're literally putting him at risk. Robert banged the gavel again. Order, please. Let's keep this civil. He shuffled some papers, clearly flustered. All right, the board will deliberate. We'll inform Mr. Reed of our decision via official letter. This hearing is adjourned. Karen looked far too smug for my liking. Meanwhile, my heart hammered. Was it truly possible that, in a single stroke, they could forbid me from using life-saving equipment? Surely not, I told myself, but the pit in my stomach refused to settle. As we filed out, Martin squeezed my shoulder. We've got your back, he whispered. This is crazy. I nodded, trying to mask the panic surging inside. Part of me clung to hope that reason would prevail. But the Glendon Karens I suggested she wouldn't rest until my generator was silenced for good. Days later, a letter arrived. My hand shook as I tore open the envelope, scanning the official text. The words leaped off the page. The Cedar Heights HOA board has determined that Mr. Reed's generator constitutes excessive noise and was installed without proper approval. He is hereby instructed to remove or disable the generator immediately. Failure to comply will result in a daily fine of $50, and the board reserves the right to take legal action if necessary. I read the lines twice, each time feeling my anger and disbelief ratchet up another notch. Remove or disable. $50 a day, plus potential legal action? And no mention, none at all, of my documented medical need? A sickening wave of anxiety washed over me. Would they actually enforce such a penalty if I ignored them? The letter included the signatures of all 5 board members, including Robert and Karen. A quick text to Martin confirmed his shock. Robert caved. He's afraid of Karen. Everyone is. My mind spun. If the power went out next week and I had to use the generator, they'd start fining me? My medical condition didn't vanish just because the HOA refused to understand it. I needed help, someone who could confirm that the generator was within code. Perhaps the city's building department or the county's power company. Yes, the power company. They had inspectors and engineers who frequently tested backup generators for compliance. If I could get official documentation from them, maybe that would override the HOA's ruling. I fired off an email to the local energy provider, Mayfield Power and Light, explaining the predicament. I included the generator's brand, model, and installation specs. To my surprise, they responded quickly. A man named Ben Wallace, a field engineer, wrote that he was happy to schedule a visit and verify compliance. The earliest slot was a week away, which felt like ages, but it was my only hope. I told him yes, absolutely, whenever he could come. In the meantime, the storms continued their onslaught. Night after night, lightning streaked the sky, thunder rattled windows, and I held my breath each time the lights flickered. If the power dipped for more than a second, my generator would roar to life. And if that happened, the HOA might start their fines. Sure enough, exactly 2 days after receiving the removal notice, the power cut out around 10 p.m. The storm was a fierce one. Torrential rain hammered every surface, and tree limbs crackled in the wind. The entire neighborhood went dark. Within seconds, my generator kicked on. My CPAP machine whirred, and my lights flickered back to life on backup power. Relief coursed through me, knowing I'd be safe for the night. But I also expected trouble. Karen didn't disappoint. At midnight, I heard her shrill voice from the street, screaming over the howling wind. Shut it off. My heart pounded as I peered out the window. She stood there, umbrella turned inside out, pointing at the generator like it was the spawn of Satan. I couldn't believe she'd stand in a storm risking lightning strikes just to harass me. I refused to open the door. Instead, I turned off the porch light and prayed she'd get the message. After a few minutes, she stomped off, presumably drenched and furious. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You were warned. Fines start tomorrow. I sank onto my couch, grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, helplessness, and a flicker of determination. I refused to risk my health. If that meant the HOA would slap me with fines, so be it. But I couldn't battle them alone, not at this rate. Thankfully, the cavalry, the power company, was on the horizon. If only they'd arrived before Karen's threats turned into something irreversibly damaging. As the days dragged on, the fines began stacking up, $50 for each night the generator ran during an outage. After a single stormy week, the tally was already at $200. A curt letter from Karen arrived, itemizing the violation fees and demanding prompt payment. I'd never felt such a potent mix of anger and indignation. I tucked the letter away, refusing to pay while I waited for the engineer's visit. If the generator was code compliant, then the HOA's fines had no real legal basis. At least, that's what I told myself. Word of my predicament spread through Cedar Heights. Some neighbors quietly placed supportive notes in my mailbox, while others, spurred by Karen's rumor-mongering, lamented that I was breaking the rules and making everyone else pay for it. It was infuriating how easily she swayed those who didn't know the full story. Jean, who had a wide network of friends, invited me to a small gathering at her house one evening, a chance to meet neighbors sympathetic to my cause. About a dozen people showed up, from middle-aged couples to a few retirees. They offered to attend the next board meeting, speak out in my defense, and sign a petition. The solidarity moved me to tears, even though I hated that it had come to this. We drafted a simple statement. We, the undersigned, support Gavin Reed's right to operate an emergency generator for medical reasons. We believe the HOA's fine policy is unjust. By the end of the night, we'd collected 15 signatures. It wasn't the whole neighborhood, but it was something. Of course, we all knew that Karen and her cronies might dismiss a petition out of hand. That's where the power company's engineer came in. Once we have official proof, the board will have to back down, Martin said, patting my shoulder. They can't argue with experts. I mustered a smile. He was right. And so I clung to that hope, counting down the days until Ben Wallace, the engineer, arrived. In the meantime, the power did fail again, a brief blackout that only lasted an hour. Enough for my generator to spin up and keep me breathing easily. Enough to tack on another $50 to the HOA's so-called violation ledger. My frustration mounted, but I kept telling myself that soon I'd have the evidence needed to knock Karen's complaint flat. At last, the date of the power company's inspection arrived. The storm clouds parted that morning, revealing a bright, crisp sky, a welcome change from the gloom. I woke up early, tidied my yard, and made sure the generator was in normal standby mode. Precisely at 10 o'clock, a white utility truck pulled up, bearing the Mayfield Power and Light logo on the door. Out stepped a tall, friendly-looking man in a neon vest, carrying a clipboard and a small toolkit. Ben Wallace, he introduced himself with a firm handshake. Good to meet you, Mr. Reed. Let's take a look at this infamous generator. I led him around the side of the house. He nodded approvingly at the acoustic enclosure, the concrete pad, and the neat wiring. You've got a high-quality setup here. The brand's known for meeting state and federal standards. Mind if I run a few tests? Be my guest, I replied, stepping back to give him space. He hooked up a small meter, typed a few readings into his tablet, and then asked me to simulate a power outage by flipping the main breaker in my service panel. My heart raced as I complied, hoping all would go smoothly. The generator hummed to life, purring steadily. Ben walked around it, measuring decibels at different distances. He tested the exhaust system, the transfer switch, everything. After about 20 minutes, he grinned. So far, so good. It's performing within normal parameters, and the noise level is well within the legal limit for residential neighborhoods. Let me just confirm a couple more readings. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That's a relief. I've been telling the HOA it meets code, but they won't listen. Ben nodded sympathetically. HOAs can be tough, but if the city allows it and it's under the decibel threshold, they really can't forbid you from using a medically necessary device. Let's finalize this. He typed in a final note. It's definitely code compliant. I'll send an official letter from Mayfield Power and Light stating that this generator meets or exceeds all relevant standards. You can show it to them. If that doesn't shut it down, I can speak to them personally. My chest flooded with gratitude. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means. Just then, a shrill voice sliced across the yard. What's going on here? Karen had appeared on the sidewalk, squinting at us with suspicion. She wore her usual formal attire, like she was perpetually ready for a board meeting. Ben gave a polite smile. Good morning, ma'am. I'm conducting a compliance check on this generator. It's in good shape, very quiet. She bristled. We have rules in Cedar Heights, you know. No one told you could come poke around. I cleared my throat. He's here at my request, Karen. As the homeowner, I can invite whomever I want onto my property. She glared at me, then turned her attention to Ben. Well, I hope you're factoring in how that thing disrupts the neighborhood. Our community has stricter standards. We can't have constant humming and rumbling. Ben remained calm, tapping his clipboard. By my measurements, the generator falls well within typical municipal noise ordinances. In fact, it's quieter than many units I've tested. If there's an HOA regulation that requires even lower noise, you'd have to provide that code in writing, but it still can't conflict with local law or medical necessity. Karen's face tightened. She looked as if she'd swallowed a lemon. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Then she narrowed her eyes at me. We'll see about that. Don't think this is over. She stalked off, phone pressed to her ear, likely calling the HOA's attorney or roping in her allies. But as I turned back to Ben, relief blossomed in my chest. Finally, I had something concrete, from an authoritative source, that could prove Karen's vendetta was groundless. True to his word, Ben emailed me a formal compliance document that afternoon, and even CC'd the city's code enforcement office. I wasted no time forwarding it to the entire HOA board, referencing the specific sections of the city's noise ordinance that the generator satisfied. Then I added a firm note. Given this official certification and the medical necessity, I expect an immediate withdrawal of the removal order and the associated fines. The hours ticked by. No response. I braced myself for more stonewalling. But by the next morning, a brief email from Robert popped up in my inbox. Mr. Reed, the board has received the engineer's report. We will discuss it at our earliest convenience and revert with a decision. Regards. Robert Hastings, HOA president. It wasn't the triumphant apology I hoped for, but it was something. Meanwhile, other neighbors caught wind of the compliance check, and the rumor mill exploded. Some said Karen was furious that the power company took your side, while others whispered that Robert was pressuring her to drop the vendetta lest the HOA face legal blowback. Sure enough, 2 days later, the HOA board circulated a new letter. To the residents of Cedar Heights, after further review, the HOA acknowledges that Mr. Gavin Reed's emergency generator is compliant with local noise regulations and fulfills a legitimate medical need. The board rescinds any prior removal order and will waive accumulated fines. Cedar Heights values the well-being of all residents and strives to find balanced solutions. No mention of Karen by name, no direct apology to me, just a terse statement of retreat. Still, it was a victory. The letter circulated by email and on the HOA's website, effectively telling the neighborhood that my generator was here to stay. I breathed a massive sigh of relief. The weight on my chest lightened, almost as if my lungs could finally expand. Martin texted me a barrage of celebratory emojis, and Jean called to say, about time. Even the Costas, who rarely got involved in disputes, ventured over to congratulate me. For a few hours, it felt like the storm clouds had finally cleared. Then Karen made her move, one last, desperate attempt to maintain her dignity. She posted a long-winded rant on the community forum, accusing me of selfishly ignoring the real concerns of neighbors and claiming that just because the city says it's legal doesn't mean it's right for our community. She ended with a scathing remark about how some people abuse medical claims for personal gain. That last line stung like a wasp. My phone blew up with notifications as neighbors chimed in, some condemning her heartlessness, others praising her for protecting property values. The thread turned into a digital battleground. I was tempted to respond, to defend my medical reality, but friends urged me to let her bury herself in her own words. Her rant sounded unhinged, especially now that the board had reversed course. The final blow came not from me, but from the local newspaper. A journalist, sniffing out the drama, reached out for comment. I declined to be interviewed, not wanting to fan the flames, but apparently the reporter gleaned enough from other sources. A week later, an article appeared. HOA's attempt to ban medical generators sparks outrage. The piece highlighted how the power company verified the device's compliance, painting Karen's stance as callous and possibly discriminatory. Fearing bad press, the HOA leadership scrambled to distance themselves from her. Robert even posted a follow-up statement clarifying that the board never intended to compromise any residents' medical needs and that miscommunication led to the initial conflict. It was obvious to anyone reading between the lines that Karen was being thrown under the bus. And so, in a quiet, anticlimactic manner, her crusade collapsed. No more letters. No more fines. The generator stayed. And each time the storm clouds rolled in, I slept peacefully, assured that if the power blinked off, my respirator would remain powered, no matter what Karen or anyone else might say. In the following weeks, the tension in Cedar Heights eased. The frenzy around my generator calmed as residents moved on to other HOA dramas, someone's new fence, a rumor about community pool rules. Yet the underlying shift was palpable. Many people recognized that Karen's once ironclad authority had fractured. She still had her loyalists, but they were fewer, and her own seat on the board was more precarious than ever. Meanwhile, the occasional storms continued, but I no longer feared a midnight knock or a threatening letter. My generator hummed quietly when needed, a comforting presence rather than a source of conflict. Some nights, I'd step outside in the drizzle, listening to that subtle whir. It was the sound of relief, of independence, of life. One afternoon, as I was pulling weeds along my driveway, I spotted Karen out for a walk. Our eyes met for a brief, awkward moment. She hesitated, perhaps weighing whether to hurl an insult or ignore me completely. Ultimately, she sped past, gaze averted. I felt an odd surge of pity for her. She'd made herself the neighborhood villain, all because she refused to understand that empathy and flexibility sometimes matter more than rigid rules. I didn't need her apology, though. The outcome spoke for itself. I'd won the right to protect my health, and a power company's engineer had validated me. The final piece was receiving an updated statement from the HOA declaring me exempt from any future noise complaints regarding the generator. Robert delivered it by hand, looking sheepish, but insisting he never wanted things to go that far. Did I believe him? Maybe partially. Karen was the prime mover, but the other board members let her run wild for too long. Still, the best resolution was simply letting the matter rest. I had my generator, they had their rules, and we found a tenuous peace. If you're listening to this tale and thinking that can't possibly happen in a civilized community, trust me, I once thought so, too. But sometimes, it only takes one person's misplaced sense of power to turn a neighborhood into a battleground. In the end, knowledge, legal compliance, and the truth prevailed. My medical needs were recognized, and Karen's complaint evaporated under public scrutiny. So that's how, in the throes of storm season, I stood my ground against an HOA tyrant. The fiasco taught me that unwavering determination, coupled with expert support, in this case, a diligent power company engineer, can topple even the loudest opposition. More than that, it reminded me of the resilience that communities can find when they band together, neighbors stepping up to defend what's right. I hope this story reassures anyone facing a similar situation that doing your homework and enlisting the right help can make a world of difference. Because no matter how stubborn a Karen might be, facts and fairness usually find a way to hum along quietly, but powerfully until justice is done.